Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it.
Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. Today we have Dr. Adrian Treves joining us. He is a leading voice for science, future generations, and the public trust, a Harvard-trained ecologist and professor of environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He founded the Carnivore Coexistence Lab in 2007 to explore how humans and large carnivores, from coyotes to grizzlies, share landscapes. For nearly 3 decades, his work has bridged law, ecology, and ethics with a focus on the public trust and intergenerational equity. Dr. Treves has published more than 130 scientific papers advancing predator-prey ecology and conservation. We are thrilled to have you here today. Welcome, Adrian.
Thank you very much. Thrilled to be here, Samantha.
Well, we'd love to start today with your North Star. You've said that your life's mission is to preserve nature for future generations of all life on Earth. What moment or experience first solidified that commitment to you?
Well, for the longest time, I was struggling with the ideas about why we do conservation. And I realized ultimately it wasn't for me or for the people around me, but it was for our kids, grandkids, the next generations. And I mean, of all humans and next generations of non-human life too, preserving the planet as a legacy for futurity.
Awesome. And you founded the Carnivore Coexistence Lab in 2007. And what was your vision at that time, and how has it evolved with how the landscape of conservation has changed?
Well, I started as a behavioral ecologist, actually a primate behavioral ecologist. I did my PhD in Uganda. I was always studying predator-prey interactions. But when I got a job in Wisconsin, I started thinking, how can I work closer to home? Had kids, and wanted to not do field trips in Africa anymore, given the family. So I was fortunate enough to be involved in a team working on wolf research, which was wolf-human coexistence in Wisconsin. That's a landscape that doesn't have a huge protected area like some people might know for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But instead, in Wisconsin, we have large tracts of state and U.S. forest land, which are mixed use and multi-use, and lots of private land. And wolves managed to recolonize that area without requiring a huge wilderness like they do in other areas.
And so I'm glad to hear that the Carnivore Conservation Lab goes out of a room. I had a vision, a very wrong but funny vision of a white room with a window and a guy and a grizzly bear in there, and they're like, "All right, let's figure this out. If he holds a flag, what happens with a grizzly bear?" So I like what you're doing there, and I would love to hear more. We, like you said, about like Yellowstone, even here in Colorado, it's vastly different on the landscape involving wolves. And so, what is habitat for wolves in Wisconsin, and what's the estimated population there, and how much are they interacting with people on the ground?
Okay, Mark, I'm going to be a little bit of a troublemaker. First of all, it's the Carnivore
Good.
Coexistence Lab, and I make
Yes.
that correction
Yes, that's what I meant.
because the word conservation is so problematic. It's been co-opted by groups that are really exploitative and killing wolves and other things unsustainably. So the word conservation is problematic, and I steer clear of it unless I really want to define terms. The other questions you ask are super important, like how does coexistence actually work? And right now, I have undergrads and a field team working with me just 1 hour north of Madison, Wisconsin, which, as most people know, Madison's the capital of Wisconsin. It's an urban and suburban area, high population density, and outside the city there are farms. So you just go 1 hour north and you can find a breeding wolf pack, at least one, living right alongside private property owners, some of whom have domestic animals. Others are like retirees. Others are nature enthusiasts. Some of them hate wolves. And yet we have coexistence working effectively very close to Madison. Now, the bulk of wolf recolonization of Wisconsin has not been in that kind of a habitat. It was further north, where there's a lower density human population and lots of things like private timberlands or private farms, large acreage. Not as large as, say, ranches out west, but, larger than the average person's yard. So wolves are able to find places to live, avoiding people, often recolonizing an area unbeknownst to the people that are living there. And it can be a surprise to folks to realize how close they're living to wolves. Oh, Samantha, I see an animal in the background there. What do you got? A cat?
I have a cat and I have my own wolf here. So you will get both. It's actually a husky mix. So yes, you get occasional animals wandering in my tiny ecosystem of my condo.
Awesome.
So I'm glad you picked up on them. But yes, I think she was fascinated about how wolves are working and living. And I think Wisconsin's such an interesting landscape because we are so used to these broad swaths of public land in the West, and you have more state land there. What's working for coexistence in Wisconsin and what isn't?
Well, I think what's working is when people have an open mind about how to coexist, not necessarily rubbing shoulders or elbows, but having mutual respect for each other and for the native animals of the landscape. So coexistence seems to work when domestic animal owners are willing to protect their domestic animals, and we consider it good, responsible animal caretaking when they use the appropriate protections for their domestic animals, whether we're talking about a farm dog, a house pet, or what are traditionally called livestock, domestic animals for commercial and productive reasons. So with the appropriate protections, non-lethal methods of protecting domestic animals, we know that very few conflicts arise and that lead to the death of any animal or any human or non-human in that kind of landscape. So coexistence, where we study it north of Madison, looks like that. Although there are people who will break the law and kill a wolf illegally. We're aiming for a kind of coexistence with minimal conflict where nobody dies and where people can continue their life and livelihood without having to eradicate the competition.
Absolutely. And one type of conflict that's always struck me about that region has been hunting dogs and wolves and how that landscape, I just don't know if it's meant to be shared that way, especially when you're using packs of dogs that are mainly for bears. How is that playing out on the landscape and why is that an issue for conflict?
Well, the hounds you're referring to are not like bird dogs that usually work within sight of their owner and within calling distance. These hounds are released sometimes on public land, sometimes on private land. Sometimes they run from one type of land to the other. And they're released and run very far from their owners, so far that the owners often have to use GPS or VHF collars to track their own dogs. And the result of that has been a lot of human complaints about trespassing, vandalism, threats, intimidation, etc. It's also resulted in dogs doing property damage, including attacking other domestic animals. And we don't have a good measure of this, but we suspect hounds are also attacking wolves. But what happens when a dog crosses into the territory of a wolf pack is it's viewed as an interloper. It's transgressing, right? It's trespassing on the wolf pack territory. And the result can often be fighting. And these hounds can be released in packs of 6, or if you have 2 hunters working together, there could be 2 packs of hounds, so 12, up to 12, or maybe even more. We don't know. This is a very hush-hush business. It's not been open to scrutiny, and the hounders who are doing this are not welcoming to those like researchers or people, videographers who'd like to film it. And there was a court case about this problem of hounders not liking to be videotaped, and it was resolved in favor of the videographers and the filmmakers. So as a hush-hush, sort of under the radar kind of activity, sometimes under the table, it's also associated with illegal activities, such as wolf poaching. So bear hunters who use dogs are the segment of Wisconsin society most prone to say they would kill a wolf illegally. And they've been vocally opposed to wolf recolonization of Wisconsin and the ongoing efforts to restore our ecosystems to a healthy, sustained native structure and diversity. So sometimes those hounds get killed in the course of an encounter with wolves, and that has led to some of the most angry claims by bear hunters and very expensive compensation payments by the state for dead hounds. So it's a fraught issue in Wisconsin. Hounding is not a traditional hunting means like stalk and shoot or using bows from blinds, which have been done for over 100 years in Wisconsin. Hounding has a much more recent history, and it's not well understood ecologically, scientifically, or from a human dimension standpoint either.
Yeah, and I think Wisconsin is a great case study on why wolves need to continue to have Endangered Species Act protections. There was that horrible 24 hours we had when those protections were listed or lifted. And how many wolves did we lose within those 24 hours? And that included hound hunting of wolves, didn't it?
Yes, it did. You're referring to the February 2021 legal public hunting, trapping, and hounding season opened on wolves, which is unprecedented.
Right.
In 3 days, the hunters overshot the quota. I forget the exact figures, but by nearly double.
Mhm.
And 80% of the wolves that were killed legally were done by hounders. In addition to hounding, the state permitted snowmobile tracking of the wolves, nighttime shooting. And this hunt occurring in February 2021 is unprecedented from the standpoint of when it happened in the year. That's during the mating and pregnancy season for wolves. So it's a period, and when there's snow on the ground. So it's a period when it's actually easier to track wolves. That's when the state has historically counted wolves because you can track them in the snow. Also, dogs and humans can detect when wolves are breeding because of signs left in the snow. And so we suspect that an unsustainable number of wolves were killed during that 3-day period. It led to lawsuits and the termination of a second wolf hunt, which would have occurred in the ordinary November dates and November-December dates that was done in past years. It also led to a clarification of our state statute on wolf hunting, in which the judge declared that 0 is a number and therefore a quota of 0 is perfectly legitimate according to statute. So a lot of changes occurred as a result of that wolf hunt, Samantha.
Yeah, and as far as your research goes, too, I think that you've done some excellent research on how killing animals like wolves and other large carnivores does not increase social tolerance. In fact, it can make things worse, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So our research was all done in Wisconsin, a little bit in Michigan as well. And so we can say with confidence that our repeated surveys of residents of Wisconsin and residents of Wolf Range in particular show that their tolerance for wolves was not increased by gradually increasing and ratcheting up the killing of wolves. First, the state allowed government agents to kill wolves. Then they allowed private landowners with permits to shoot a wolf if it's on their property. Then they allowed public hunting and trapping and hounding. Each time after each of those policy changes, we made measurements using questionnaires, mailback survey questionnaires, or with focus groups. And each time we found that tolerance for wolves either did not change or it went down, in particular among male residents of Wisconsin's Wolf Range who had experience with hunting. Their tolerance for wolves actually went down when the state made it legal or easier to kill wolves. we've also shown this effect through measurement of poaching, namely that people are more likely to poach, are less tolerant of wolves, and therefore more likely to act illegally against policies and state laws when the state sends a signal that there's something about the wolf population, something negative, that there's too many wolves, or the population needs control, or the state needs help in managing wolves. That's when poaching goes up. So in a nutshell, increasing killing has not improved tolerance for wolves. And by the way, there's no other evidence from any other region in the world. There's some claims made about Montana having done a survey, but really that showed tolerance for the agency policy, not tolerance for wolves, changed when they had a wolf hunting season in Montana.
It's really interesting, and I'm glad you brought up Montana. I know that they're going to be going through some changes on their policies through their commission in August. And they're looking at reducing the number of wolves on the landscape by, it could be by as many as 500. And are you involved with advocacy around making sure that number doesn't drop too far from, they've had a steady population of around 1,100 for about 10 years now. I fear, listening to what you've said about that quick season in Wisconsin, that something like this could have really bad impacts immediately in Montana.
Yeah, I have similar concerns that their very high quota will lead to an unsustainable and uncontrolled killing season on wolves. I'm involved in a scientific study that questions those population estimates by the state of Montana. It's based on a technique called the IPOM, which uses apparently it uses surveys of hunters and trappers, and those data have not been made available to scientists, even on specific request to the authors. Those data are not available. They may not even exist. It's unclear at the moment. So you've got a state population estimate for wolves based on invisible data, and that's simply not credible, which brings into question the entire claim of science-based management by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So at the moment, a quota of 500 wolves in a hunting season, based on absolutely no scientific estimate of the wolf population, that's cause for concern, whether or not you like wolves or not. I don't think Montanans are in support of extirpation of the wolf population. And the document that Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks shared with its legislative committee indicates that the agency is aware of the risk of extirpating wolves in Montana if the quota of 500 were followed. So I think we can listen to the agency itself in its concerns about the policy the legislature has put forward.
I've heard time and again in agencies where they say, oh, we're just following the science, or this is what the science says. And really, they're asserting values, and they're asserting their own values and prescribing those values to wildlife management. And that's something I've learned a lot from you, Adrian. How does that play out across state agencies?
Thanks, Samantha. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a common claim by state and federal agencies in the U.S., but also beyond the U.S., a common claim by agencies that they're basing their decisions on science. That's a myth. And let's just bust that myth every time we can. Policies are based on values. Policies are decided by what the policymakers think should be or ought to be in the future, or the way we should act, or the way we ought to coexist or need to do. Those are all words that reflect values: should, ought, need. Science just tells us what the conditions are now, maybe what they were in the past. Science can make predictions about what will happen in the future if a certain policy is implemented, but that doesn't tell policymakers what to do. So one of the most problematic claims in U.S. wildlife management today is that management is science-based and the policymakers are following the science. That's just hoo-ha. And the public needs to call out those policymakers for that double talk. Because really what they're doing is they're hiding their values behind what's often really hard for the public to understand, which is the scientific formulas, models, even the lingo of scientists can be hard to unpack. And if policymakers hide behind it, they're doing the public a disservice. Instead, policymakers should ask the experts to translate it into as simple language as possible. And then policymakers should be transparent about what values they're following. For instance, it would be really honest if Wisconsin lawmakers had said, we're going to hunt wolves because that's what we've always done, or, whatever, because we like it, whatever, some value statement, right? And then they should have said, the science tells us X, Y, and Z is sustainable. That's as simple a statement as is needed to not pull the wool over the public's eyes, because then the public that wants to debate values can debate the values. Why? Just because it's been traditional to hunt wolves, that doesn't mean it's the correct thing to do now, right? Slavery was traditional for a while. It's not the right thing to do now. And the people who want to debate the science can just focus on the formulas, the models, and the claims being made by scientists. And by the way, Wisconsin's wolf population estimate is not better than Montana's. It seems to count dead wolves as if they were alive. So there's a lot to debate about the science. But those two things should be separated rather than clouding and muddying the public policy debate by claiming it's science-based policy, when at best it's science-informed, or they made a value judgment first and are searching for science with which to support it.
Yeah, and with agency culture too, I have seen time and again that agencies are not open to outside scientific critique. So we don't even get to debate the science with other scientists. We often are stuck with the agency saying we are the bearer of science and we own the science without owning the values associated with prescribing the policy. And how do we work with that? How do we get more agency policies to be informed by outside review?
Well, I couldn't have said that better. This is an enduring bit of frustration. For me, it's been a fight of 14 years, ever since I started asking the scientists in the agencies some awkward questions about how they were handling data. So how do we do this? For one thing, courts remain a battlefield for evidence. So if you're going to bring evidence to a political battle, we often have to have recourse to the courts. And thank goodness our system of government has a balance of power so that courts have a role in our constitutional democracy, and we can challenge laws and regulations through the courts. Some judges are still willing to hear evidence, and there's excellent lawyers out there, as you know, Samantha, excellent lawyers who understand the science very well and can write way better than I can so that a judge can understand the science. And that's one way. Also, the second way is the public can challenge every claim made by policymakers that appears to be a fact claim, right? An assertion of fact made by policymakers can be challenged with competing assertions of fact. In an ideal society, when you have like a set of experts, maybe even 3 different types of experts, all coming together with slightly different views, there can be a debate about the methods, so that maybe the public and policymakers can evaluate which is the best evidence based on the methods. Unfortunately, because agencies are cherry-picking their preferred scientists and excluding those of us who have different opinions or different evidence, we're not even having that debate over who's got better methods. It's happening in the peer-reviewed scientific literature a little bit, but even that could improve. So I've gone on way too long for that one question. It's a huge, interesting, important topic. Thanks for asking.
Well, our listeners much prefer to hear brilliant people such as yourself to me, and then to a lesser extent, Sam. I'd like to talk about advocacy and how scientists tend to shy away from that word, but you embrace it. What do you think the idea of being an activist scientist is, And why do you think it makes people uncomfortable?
Okay, so let's first divide the two words advocacy and activism. Every time a scientist speaks about their science, they're advocating for their science. That's one thing. And that's okay. We should be doing that. What makes people a little more uncomfortable, even when they're doing it perfectly, including me, is to advocate for the policy implications of our results. And I'm not being a hypocrite here. When I say policy implications of our results, I'm not saying our results should dictate the policy. I'm saying that our results have something to say about current policy or proposed policy, right? So when I say that science can predict the outcomes of policy, I'm saying that science has implications for policy, and it would be nice if policymakers would pay attention to that. So that's the kind of advocacy I'm very comfortable with. And then one can be more or less activist about it, right? You might, many scientists and me for many years were just satisfied with our peer reviewed publications, put it out there, and a handful of people read it. Well, as society has become more conflicted and there's been culture clashes over any number of topics, there has been a greater demand for scientific evidence to help resolve or inform public policy debates. And some scientists are less comfortable with stepping into that arena and being loud and communicating their science through any mechanism and mode that's out there. Some scientists are more or less comfortable with it. I tend to be more comfortable with it because I've thought hard about the ethics and what we owe the public as scientists. So here's Sam, where I get to talk about the public trust.
Great. I'm really excited. Go ahead.
So I was funded largely by public monies. A lot of my grants were from public sources. There's always a balance of public and private sources. And so I owe the public something. Not only a thank you for my education and the work and the career I've had, which I've been very fortunate to have, but I owe them some of the information, some of the fruits of the science, right? And that means that I can't really be satisfied with just putting out a peer-reviewed article and having 12 people around the world read it. So I try to reach out to the press like you, the broadcast media, and to the traditional broadcast media, right? New York Times, Washington Post, whatever it might be. And speaking publicly about my research. That's what I think is a service to the public. When I really believe my own methods and results, I should be willing to advocate for them. Now, there is you can go to an extreme there where I start to only report the science that I think will please a certain audience. I try to be very careful about that line. And we have it on both sides of this debate. If you take the pro-wolf or the anti-wolf continuum of the public, you've got scientists who are super anti-wolf and they are only reporting negative things about wolves because they depend on hunting money or government agency money, or they live in a particular state. And you also have people on the other extreme, extremely pro-wolf, who will never say anything bad about wolves or never say anything good about hunters or whatever it might be, right? So our communications do need to be balanced by our results. I'm trying to find that line all the time. I think scientists are all trying their best to find that line and not go to either of those extremes. But in a nutshell, that's why it's an uncomfortable topic for scientists, right? So we try to be neutral, but it's difficult. We are humans, we have our values, and that leads us to ask certain questions and prefer certain answers. Sometimes it leads us to prefer certain methods, but if we're self-censoring because of our funders, then that's a competing interest. And competing interests need to be declared, otherwise the science becomes tainted. So my colleagues and I are now practicing a thoroughgoing transparency where we post our funding sources online. I believe your podcast will share a link to our website, for my lab's website. You'll see on a page there where we just open our our portfolio. You can look at my entire CV for my whole career and all the funding for the last 15 years. And if you need to go further back than 15 years, you can reach out to me. I'll send that to you. Anyway, we aim for this thoroughgoing transparency because there's no way to eliminate the bias generated by just being people and having values. Since you can't eliminate that kind of bias, the best thing to do is to expose it so an audience can say, all right, these are the methods they used. These are the biases these scientists have. Might that have colored their interpretations? The last thing I'll say on this topic is that the best science has the best methods, regardless of the personal views of the scientists. So really, adjudicating between different scientific studies that conflict depends on which one used the best methods, not who did the science.
What are your views? I've seen it here in Colorado, where organizations like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation have donated money to the state agency to fund research on a specific species. Do you find that can be problematic?
It's potentially problematic. So any donor, whether it's the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation or the state itself, any donor can exert undue and improper influence on a researcher so that they silence them. The scientist silences themselves or silences the data. And that's censorship. That's undue, improper influence, in my view. If money is given with no strings regarding the methods used or the communications made by that scientist, then it doesn't matter who the donor is, where the money's coming from. But in my experience, states have been tried to be the most controlling of science. So the grants that I've gotten from, in one case, a tribal government, in other case, the state of Wisconsin government, they tried to influence the results. They tried to silence us. So I'm most suspicious of government funding when it comes with those kinds of strings. But I imagine the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation also has strings, and sometimes the strings are implicit. They're, oh, if you don't say something we like, we're not going to fund you ever again, or we're going to badmouth you on our social networks. So those kinds of strings worry me almost more than the ones that are written in black and white on grant contracts.
Mark, great minds think alike, because I was thinking very much a similar question along those lines. And I was reflecting back on the Piceance Basin predator control studies and how those were funded by oil grants, when we know habitat encroachment is a huge cause of mule deer habitat loss. And they were looking for other reasons and killing off carnivores, and how problematic that can be. How do we start to shift that narrative? I know that some of the work I've done in the past with Washington Wildlife First or other organizations, we've tried to even join or support financially organizations like the Association for Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and they wouldn't take our money. And states won't take NGO money if it's not a values-aligned NGO, but they're not very public about that either, right? So yes, we were declined by AFWA, Adrian. But how do we, as environmental NGOs, as folks that really want to promote coexistence, how do we infiltrate that structure and do better?
Wow. I think, Sam, the simple answer is we need reform of wildlife governance. So that's a topic very close to certain NGOs' heart that I'm close to, Wildlife for All. So just in a nutshell, when I refer to public trust, I'm referring to 150 years of Supreme Court of the U.S. common law precedents, case law, that says that all components of the environment are held in trust for current and future generations of the U.S. public. An interesting sidebar to this, it never specifies that the future U.S. public is only humans. So a bunch of us are starting to think about and advocate for expanding that definition to include non-humans, that the U.S. public is basically all life in the U.S., and nature today is held in trust like a legacy for future generations of all life. So under that kind of a framework, the government's the trustee. It is not an interested party. It should be selfless. It should be an uninterested party that treats all beneficiaries equally. Unfortunately, what we have now are wildlife agencies that are beholden to a small paying clientele, often the permit holders, or like you're suggesting, those donors or interest groups that can give them large amounts of money to keep the bureaucracy working. That's not trusteeship. A trustee is like with your financial charities, your fiduciary trustee has a specific charge, and in this case, it would be preserving nature for future generations. And the trustee is treating all beneficiaries equally under that charge. And a trustee, like you're suggesting, probably wouldn't be accepting private money because it creates a competing interest. But if they were accepting private money, they would be accepting it equally from all beneficiaries who want to give. And it really wouldn't matter who gave them the money, they would still behave the same way. Unfortunately, we don't have that model currently in U.S. state or tribal or federal wildlife agencies. Instead, we have a fee-based client kind of model, which is basically trying to privatize land and wildlife for the highest bidder. And that's a system that creates corruption and it creates unsustainable use of nature, which is ultimately betraying our trust duty for future generations of all life.
Yeah, and we're in a weird position right now too, because as we see the hunting and trapping participation dwindling across the states, and some agencies are then relying on out-of-state tags, or just increasing tag prices across the board to maintain their revenue streams, and it seems like they're holding on to that model as long as they can before before the ship goes down. And the only way is going to be through diversified revenues. And I was thinking too, when you were talking about fiduciaries, and with a corporation, the fiduciary responsibility is to maximize profits, and I would love to see that similar kind of thing where we maximize each species to their getting as close to their population thresholds as possible, and sustaining their habitats. And so what do you see as the way forward from here, and as we're going to have to figure out some different revenue streams?
Thanks for that question, Mark. I think general revenues from the state are the least corruptible. Because if you think about it, when tax revenues and sales tax and so forth and tolls and stuff, when they go into the general revenue coffers, no one really knows who the donor was. And therefore, when they're reallocated by the legislature, that money is to some extent free of strings. Of course, it's affected by the political winds in the legislature, but it's free of strings to the donors directly. And that reduces the competing interest if the agency can be based on general revenue funds. The direction I see us going in the future, by the way, I'm actually really optimistic because the youth that I teach, 18 to 21-year-olds in college, I teach hundreds every year. They are a lot nicer, generous, altruistic than I think my generation was. So I'm actually really optimistic about the future once we can get through the sort of current bottleneck of current thinking. So what I see in the future is a trusteeship model. And here I'm thinking both of a fiduciary, as you and I were talking about, Mark, but also trusteeship that's given to people who need special protection, whether it's minors, a minor, someone who's too young to represent themselves in court or in a political process, or people who, through incapacitation, have to have an advocate for them. It's often called receivership or guardianship. That's also a form of trusteeship, where specially people specially devoted to those protected populations are speaking for them, whether they get legal standing in courts and so can speak for them to a judge, or whether they get special recognition in a political process like a decision-making process. Let me give you another analogy. Tribes in Wisconsin are sovereign nations. They deal on a government-to-government basis with the state of Wisconsin, so they have a co-management arrangement and a co-trusteeship of wildlife with the state of Wisconsin. The tribes do. And therefore, the tribes go to federal court when they want to challenge the state, so that there's an advocate for the tribes who can speak for the seventh generation view, who can speak for future generations of Ojibwe tribes. We actually need that for non-humans and for nature too. We need trustees who can speak and get legal standing or appear in a political process as equals with states. That's a trusteeship model where we're going to see the balance of power rectified, rebalanced in the USA towards a more sort of wise, sustainable, and preservationist vision of nature.
Yeah, a friend of mine, our friend of the pod, David Niels, he always asks me whenever I go to a commission meeting, so how many wolves were in the room? How many of them spoke at public comment? And yeah,
Exactly.
I think that is an important piece that is missing, and being able to have them represented would be
100%.
ideal.
Yeah, David also asked that question. He says, how is trapping the bobcats benefiting the bobcats? And it's interesting how much agency personnel will avoid directly answering that question because the science and values and they don't line up and they don't like that answer. So yeah, it's really interesting. I had a question, and you touched a bit on, trustee policies. If you could rewrite one conservation law or policy today that would better serve future generations, what would it be?
Well, the Endangered Species Act touches on this. I've found 7 provisions of the Endangered Species Act that evoke public trust principles, like I've been talking about. But ideally, the Congress of 1973 would have written an explicit provision that the Secretary of Interior is a trustee for nature for all of the U.S. public, current and future. That would have saved us a heck of a lot of trouble. Maybe, of course, Congress doesn't have perfect control over how the agency implements its acts, but I think it would have helped if I could have waved my magic wand.
Go back into the 1970s and switch that up a bit. And I just had one last question, unless Mark, you had one more question.
Go for it.
So my question is, for our listeners, what advice would you give young scientists or advocates who feel torn between staying objective with science and standing up for what they believe in?
Okay, first thing is shed this idea that you're objective. Everybody's biased, and therefore you have to be transparent about your bias and understand it well yourself so you can control it. Really, what we want are scientists who are impartial and neutral about the evidence. Then go forth and conquer, advocate, and be an activist when you feel strongly about your results. And finally, be ready to be wrong. I've lost confidence in some of my own results and writings, and I've been tried to be public about where I've lost confidence. So be ready to be wrong. Admit when you're wrong, because when people are wrong and then they fix it, they get more respect than when they just turn a blind eye to being wrong and try to move on pretending it never happened. That just doesn't build confidence.
No, it doesn't. And we've seen it time and time again as our politicians stay steadfast in their ways while everyone's shaking their heads. But you're wrong. But I think that you were right on everything you said today. And so I think you should continue to be steadfast and your mission. And we thank you for coming on to the podcast today. And hopefully that you've inspired some of our listeners to advocate more and be that activist. So thank you, Adrian.
And lead with their values. Yeah. Thank you, Adrian. We appreciate you.
Thank you for translating my science for the public. It's invaluable service. So thank you so much.
This has been an episode of The Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.